Welcome to our fifth discussion on grief in the book of Job. Today we're going to be talking about Job's friends. And just in case this is the first time you're joining in, this is Dr. Lance Hawley. I'm Dr. Kevin Shelby. And we're just trying to have some candid discussion about how Job interacts with the ideas of grief and suffering. And so today we really want to focus in on the community of faith around Job and how they respond to his grief. So I'm just going to lead off with a question, Lance. What is going on with his friends here in the book?
Right, so Job's friends have kind of two stages, or really three. But at first they come and grieve with Job in chapter 2. And they're silent with Job for 7 days. They tear their robes. They do all the things that they should be doing for somebody who's mourning. They're joining Job.
You say should be. Grief. Does that mean according to the text?
Right. I think it's implied that they're doing the appropriate thing.
Okay.
That they see how terrible it is for Job, and that's when they rip their robes. I mean, it's not just rote action, but they're really grieving with him. And at this point, Job is not saying anything, and neither are they. Right, so they're silent for a long time, which may be something we could think about with grief. But in any case, with the friends, I think silence is always at a premium. They can't go wrong with silence. And Job will even later say, once they start talking, you should just be silent. But they break their silence as a reply to Job. I think it's important to recognize, as far as the book goes, that Job speaks first. And Eliphaz, so there's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They begin talking only as a response to what Job says in chapter 3. And a lot of their criticism has not to do with trying to explain why he's endured this trauma, this loss, but a criticism about the way that Job is talking. I've said it before, I think, but one of the main messages is that that's not you, Job. You don't talk like that, because Job has been saying some pretty radical theological things about God, namely, God did this to me, and God has acted unjustly.
Yeah.
Which they don't have a category for God functioning in that way. And so, when Eliphaz starts speaking, he asks, would it be okay if I said something? I mean, who could not say something when you're talking like this? And then he'll go on to bring some criticisms, but it's a vague criticism. A lot of it's an encouragement. However, later, like by the end of the dialogue, by Eliphaz's third speech in chapter 22, it's blatant accusation that he's taking advantage of the widow and the orphan and stripped the poor of their clothing and all these things that are just sort of absurd. But they don't get there right away.
So they're getting progressively more and more concerned with how Job is speaking, and as they go along through the book, they want to set him right by the end. Yeah. That's the point.
I think all the way through, it's
theologically right.
Theologically correct, and also for his own safety. I think they're this warning in here, like, look, if you talk like that, you're going to go into a very dark place, so God will punish you. I don't think it's so far-fetched. Often the friends get portrayed as these fools who care nothing for Job, but that's really not the picture in the book of Job. But I think we need to look closer at them to see our own tendencies and trying to counsel people who are grieving.
Yeah.
A lot of it is, what do you do when somebody is driving you crazy with their grief? Whether it's just repeatedly coming to you and you get tired of it, which eventually kind of happens in the book of Job, or even at the beginning when somebody just says something that you don't agree with theologically about why they're suffering. They give a diagnosis of, God has mistreated me. And do you say, well, do you try to push back on that?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the friends do. They do it in sort of abstract ways, and they try to give counsel. They try to softly rebuke at first and then harshly at the end. But it seems to me that the appropriate response is just to either say nothing at least in that case. Or, maybe you could say more about how you should appropriately respond to somebody who's saying something that is, theologically errant. Like, I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that statement you just made, but you as a sufferer, I want to care for you.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a lot of the same pressures to want to caution people about where they go, because we start to get afraid of where they might end up within their thinking. And so I think it's natural to want to help correct somebody's theological perspective of what's happening.
Yeah.
But I don't think in the midst of somebody's deep grief and deep loss that's the moment to correct their theology.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I hear you saying, like, that when they're silent, and then when they're dealing with just some of the theological stuff, they're kind of getting more and more concerned about correcting Job's opinion and description of what God has done. And I think that's, from my perspective, I think that's where they go wrong, is that's where I would be critical of his friends, to say, like, when if I were to be talking to a community of faith about how you respond to somebody's grief, let's say they've lost a child, and you're sitting with them and they say, God did this to my kid, God killed my child. I don't think that's the moment for us to say, well, let's, that's a little too far, so let's,
hey, no, hold on.
You're going too far here, because...
What should you say then?
Maybe nothing. Or, I'm sorry. Or, I'm hurting with you. Like, I think being with somebody in their pain, and knowing that your tolerance threshold is maybe lower than it should be. If that's the case, then be quiet. But if you have the ability to say something, stand with them in their pain.
Right. And I think that's an important thing. Job will accuse his friends of basically defending God. Of course, he goes into this legal metaphor of he's taking God to trial and so on, but they're standing up as witnesses for God, or advocates, and God doesn't need that. And Job says, you should be taking my side. Even if you don't agree with me, you should be taking my side. And that seems to be the key. And in the end, actually, God, in chapter 42, verse 7, it says to Eliphaz that he was wrong about the way that he spoke about God.
Yeah.
He had they were wrong in the way that they were talking to Job. They were wrong of that in defending God, because God actually did do this to Job. But the book of Job doesn't help us diagnose individual cases of suffering. So no. I think that's a major takeaway, is that we shouldn't be in it to diagnose suffering. We need just to be present.
Right.
And that seems to be the major takeaway. And community is so important to people who are grieving.
Well, we have talked about experiments in grief that Job is going through in order to process his pain. I think similarly, you see the friends experiment with what a community does in response to grief. And I'd say the last two experiments that they do, starting both of them really trying to correct his theology, move them in the wrong direction. As a community of faith, we need to be able to be a place that supports the broken and the hurting in their brokenness, and not trying to fix them or correct them, and not allowing them to experience their pain.
Yeah, and I think that's totally right. I think it's really challenging. As easy as it is to say that we should be present and be quiet, it's really difficult sometimes to bite your tongue and just to be present. And there are maybe times later to talk through some of the theological issues, but in the midst of somebody ranting and raving, we can just be present with them. I think that's kind of the major takeaway from observing the friends.
And I would say that we get uncomfortable because we're not sure whether it's normal or not. We start looking for normalcy. And what's most important is for us to recognize there isn't really a normal when it comes to grief. And sometimes people need to rant and rave. Sometimes people need to cry in their room by themselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes they need to be with people. Whatever it is, we can't allow ourselves to be pushed to this place of expectation of what
Yeah.
somebody is doing.
Yeah.
And if we can refrain from doing that, then maybe our threshold for their suffering will raise a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So we thank you for joining us in the conversation today. We're going to have to wrap it up now, but we'd love to dialogue with you more about some of the things we've talked about today. So feel free to comment on Facebook, and we'll try to respond or maybe address whatever issues come up in our next discussion. Have a great day.
Lord bless you.